right, looks like we are now live. I'm just pouring myself a NA Guinness. Have a nice little treat around noontime here. Looks like we've already got some questions lined up. So I get this poured and I'll start seeing what we got. So Dan the Man says, I often struggle with imposter syndrome and self-doubt relating to my philosophical or academic abilities. Have you ever struggled with this? Do you have any advice? Yeah, I mean, I think most of us in any sort of like intellectual or creative fields either have struggled with imposter syndrome or should have struggled with imposter syndrome and didn't because they were wrongly and over confident about things, right? I've gone through periods where, like, especially like writing my dissertation, I was like, is this stuff actually any good or not? And do I actually know what the hell I'm talking about? And sometimes that happens because you've got so much stuff kind of stuck up there in your head and you're trying to manage it all and you're not expressing it quite as well as you would like to. So I think it's kind of a natural part of one's course of development to feel imposter syndrome, at least at certain points and for a while. And sometimes you can like be invited to something and you can be like, why do these people want me here? I'm not like an expert on this, or what do I actually have to contribute? And so I would say advice, right? So one thing that you could remember is that lots of other people struggle with it, that it's not just you on your own doing it, that it's part of a normal process of getting better at stuff, and that it might be also a source for intellectual humility, which is a good thing. You know, not humility as like, oh, I don't know anything, but humility in the sense of like thinking about yourself in relation to others in a realistic way, you know, actually understanding your own capacities. If you find it's like paralyzing you, maybe you need to do like reminders to yourself. Like, I actually do know what I'm talking about. I don't have to be a perfect expert on everything, but I do have some things to contribute. You know, I'm not like totally unknowledgeable or anything like that. But yeah, it's a common problem that a lot of people deal with. So it's a good question. Another question about a different phenomenon, but also you could say a psychological matter. So Black Prairie says, been going through an existential crisis. Every day I feel nauseous because I'm not sure if there's life after death. Being is so mysterious, and I've been trying to wrap my head around it. Viewing life only as materialist and mechanical is reductive, but I can't seem to view things otherwise. What am I not seeing? What's your relationship with God, and how can I implement metaphysics? So let's start with the mechanical, materialist, reductive thing. You know, it's possible to be a materialist without being a mechanist. And there are materialists who are non-reductive materialists who view meaning, possibility, even they'll call it spirit, as something that emerges from matter. George Santayana is a good example of that. Friedrich Nietzsche would be another example of that. You know, he says that there ultimately is no spirit or soul behind things. We have our bodies and that's it. But, you know, it's not as if our bodies are completely well known. I mean, the thing is with people who are, you know, materialists in a reductive sense, you could say that they're claiming way more than they have a right to claim. how the hell do they know that the whole universe is mechanical or anything like that? We see like just a tiny little bit of it. So I don't think that materialism and mechanism have to go together. And can you live a life without believing in an afterlife or God or some other metaphysics that would give you like a transcendent meaning, and you know, be okay with it? Sure. I mean, people have throughout time. This is what Heidegger calls finitude, and we can embrace it rather than just be bothered by it. You know, you could think about like Marcus Aurelius and his remarks about whether it's atoms and randomness or Stoic providence, I can actually still live a good life. So there's models for us of people who took on those sort of metaphysical points of view and didn't succumb to nihilism or nausea or depression or stuff like that. And you might look into those people. They might help a bit, I would say. Ben Felt says, I'm about to start reading Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. I've read Rothbard and Rand. Is there anything I should keep an eye out for in regard to this work? I think you could probably read Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia cold on its own because he explains a lot of things along the way. I don't know that reading Rothbard and Rand is particularly important for reading Nozick, but I'm not a Nozick scholar by any means. I don't read him very often. Actually, I don't find him very interesting, frankly. But, you know, it's cool that you're going to read it. It's a great text. But, yeah. All right. Lapse 9 Continuum. Hope this isn't too political, but I'm seeing more and more people pushing back against climate science, green initiatives. I find it concerning, and I don't understand why. Any thoughts on what's going on? Well, I mean, that's been going on for a very long time, right? Conservatives here in America have been trying to debunk and, you know, supplement their own science with quotes for actual climate science, which is a great consensus on, for a couple generations now. It used to be that conservatives here in America were actually, and they're not really conservatives because they haven't conservatism, because guess what conservatives were for even further back? Conservation, clean air, you know, the EPA, all that stuff was passed under Nixon, who was a real conservative back then. So there's there have been lots of people, and a good bit of it is driven by money and lobbying. You know, the fossil fuel industries were just dumping tons and tons of money into think tanks and buying people in our Congress and governors. And, you know, it's the way our political process unfortunately works. And they're quite powerful, just like the tobacco lobby used to be years and years ago. You know, it took us a long, long time to actually get recognition that smoking tobacco could be bad for you. So that's an unfortunate feature of our politics. And so for a long time, American conservatives were the outliers. You would look at conservatives in other countries, and they all believed climate change was happening. But somehow they all got foxified, you know, and I use that as a word for people in other countries who wind up taking on interesting features of American conservatism, like being, you know, super about guns or being for the First Amendment when they don't have an amendment like that in their country, right? So that's part of the picture of what's going on. It doesn't have to bring you down. And I don't know that there's more people right now who are against green initiatives or against climate science than there were 5 or 10 years ago. It seems to me to have kind of stabilized. So, as interestingly, there was a newspaper article just yesterday about how clearly climate has changed here in Wisconsin, and we better get ready for snowless winters because that seems to be where we're going, right? So it probably depends on where you are, right? Mark says, what were some lasting lessons from your PhD experience. Oh, anything you wish you knew going in. Any bands whose music kept you motivated at the time? I wouldn't say there were bands that like kept me motivated in the sense that like if I didn't have them, I wouldn't have like made it through the PhD. But there were bands that I would listen to quite a lot when I was writing papers. And it was the 90s. So a lot of these were bands that were kind of big in the 90s or performers. Like I would listen to Helmet. I actually wrote my first paper on St. Anselm for the first St. Anselm conference, doing an all-nighter, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, and listening to two of Helmet's albums, like on continuous play on my CD player. I really liked PJ Harvey's To Bring You My Love at the time. Alice in Chains, I was listening to a lot, in Tool. Who else? Some, like Pearl Jam's 10, Stone Temple Pilots Core, quite a few other things. But back to grad school, so a little bit more seriously. Anything I wish I knew going in? Yeah. Now, things turned out for me pretty good, despite not knowing this. But it would have been really helpful if somebody had told me how, sort of like the dirty little secrets about how academia works, which is that if you want to get hired, it's not enough just to have a degree. And people are going to be looking at not just your publications and how smart you are. They're going to look much more at what school did you go to? Who's writing your letters of recommendation? Like who are your contacts, and where are you teaching once you actually have a job? So going to a school that has a much better reputation, even though it's all bullshit, people at Harvard aren't any smarter than people at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. They're just better connected. Right? Knowing that that's the academic game and that it's rigged. It's not a fair meritocracy. It's not even a lottery. It's that those who are well connected do much better. That probably would have been good to know. And to know it both in the sense of like, here's how you get by, and also don't expect things to be fair. When you send out your job applications, realize that you may not even get considered because you're not you're not even in the running because you didn't go to the right school, or other people have better connections than you do. So I think that would have been good to know. All right. John says, any general advice for someone who's going through tough times for the past few years and struggling to stay optimistic? I don't really have any general advice. That's the sort of thing where you'd want to get into specifics, because anything that I could say in general would just be platitudes, right? Be like, things aren't that bad. You have control over aspects of your life. Well, you already know that. So I don't think that's going to be particularly helpful. This is one of those things where we probably need to be more specific about what you want to be optimistic about. Relationships, will I ever meet somebody, health, jobs, education, the world as a whole. Each of those presents us with its own particular challenges, don't they? All right. San C, what's your opinion of Robert Pirsig's work? I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance when I was in college, and even then I wasn't impressed with it because I think he got Aristotle wrong in a way that hippie types tend to do. It's certainly of an era. I think part of the problem was the book had been talked up so much. It was like, oh, this is an amazing philosophy book. And then I read it and I was like, it's okay. It's not great. I keep on meaning to like go back and reread it. Maybe I was too dismissive of it at the time. That's happened in the past with me, but I don't know. Maybe it isn't that great. Maybe it's one of those things that people just kind of connected to in a certain time and then, felt like, well, this is really, really cool. I need to like tell everybody else about this. So I don't know. Ben asks about Andrea Dworkin, are you familiar with her work? I've been enjoying her fiction and nonfiction quite a bit. Nah, I think I may have read her a little bit in grad school, but I haven't read anything by her since then. But that doesn't mean anything. There's, infinitely more people that I haven't read than I have read. So, here's a good question from Socrates' great-grandson. Is Aristotle's conception of megalopsychia, which means great souledness or magnanimity, similar in any way to the contemporary notion of having high self-esteem? No, because you can have high self-esteem that's totally based on bullshit, which would be the vice that's opposed to megalopsychia. High self-esteem just means you think a lot of yourself. It doesn't say why you do or whether you rightly think highly of yourself. It could be vanity or bad pride, right? The person who actually has megalopsychia, Aristotle says, is deserving of great honors, and they expect them from people. But they don't expect them from people below them. They expect them from their peers. And they're actually very good to people who are in lower positions. Whereas a person who has high self-esteem, they could be like that, but they could also be a real prick because they think they're better than everyone else, and they're actually not better than everyone else. So they don't overlap. All right. Orville, at the beginning of the Republic, when Polemarchus and the group chase Socrates down and make him come back to Polemarchus' house, is that a thinly veiled commentary on democracy? I don't think so at all. I haven't heard that interpretation. That would be, there's plenty of attacks on democracy in the Republic that are quite open. I don't think you need to read them saying, we're going to make you come along and hang out with us. I think that's just they like hanging out with Socrates. And they threaten to compel him to come. But he wants to come anyway because he loves chatting with people about stuff. So I don't see that at all. All right. Did Stephen have an earlier thing? Oh, you're writing to Orville. Okay. Idle Sum. Any advice for writing a good writing sample for graduate school? Okay. You don't necessarily need to write a new paper for a writing sample. You probably already have some decently developed papers from your undergraduate classes that maybe you could send in. You definitely want to polish it, get some feedback on it and all that. Applying to graduate school is kind of a black box. You have no idea what they're actually going to be looking at, what they care about, whether they'll read your writing sample or not. Unless you know people and they tell you exactly what's going on and they're not lying to you. But if you're applying to a place where you don't know anybody except by their names and maybe what they've published, you don't really know what they're going to care about. I wrote a writing sample myself that was so weird and idiosyncratic that it almost sunk me. I had written this bachelor's honors thesis on isometric truth self-referential statement groups, demonstrating using sort of a mathematical notation that I developed that truth self-referential statement groups could be either reduced to a tautology or to the liar's paradox. And then for my writing sample, I realized that you could actually geometrically model this by saying that they all reduce to the Möbius strip, or to, which would, works for the liar's paradox, or just to a plain old strip. And I wrote that up and sent that in. It was like a 3-page paper. And talking later on with the chair at the time, he was like, we didn't have no idea what the hell this was or what to do with this. And we, frankly, if your GRE scores hadn't been high, we probably would have just thrown your application out altogether. So, you never know. Just try to do the best. Make sure, of course, it's spell checked, grammar checked. You've had some people look over it. But I think that, if you got a good conference paper, you could use that. You could say this paper was previously given at such and such a conference. And then people might be like, oh, well, this person's, trying to do research. So that's good. And Olivia, any modern theologians you would recommend reading? No, because I don't read a lot of theologians, and theology is not really an area, and I'm not sure what modern is for you. Do you mean like 20th century? Do you mean like going back into, in philosophy, modern philosophy begins in around 1600. So, but no, I don't have any particular recommendations in general. Oh, here's a good literature one. John Garrell. Thoughts on the distinction between hard and soft science fiction. What do you prefer and why? So if we want to summarize it with kind of like a thumbnail sketch, and granted, there's like a continuum here, right? It's not a on-off switch where everything is either hard or soft. Hard science fiction makes at least a real effort to have what it's talking about actually line up with science as we currently know it. So, hard science fiction from much earlier, like say the 19th century or early 20th century, might not be in conformity to how we understand physics, astronomy, stuff like that in the present. But it's certainly attempting to do that. Soft science fiction, now it might be rigorous in the sense of like bringing in stuff from the social sciences, right? But sometimes it's just science fantasy. And, like Star Wars, for example, right? Nobody knows how all this crap works. As a matter of fact, bringing in ideas like, midichlorians for the Force, trying to make it a little bit more hard science fiction. I think that was a mistaken move to do on the part of Lucas and the other people involved. Star Wars is fine the way it was. But it's clearly not science fiction. It's more science fantasy or space opera or whatever you want to call it, right? So which do I prefer? It depends on the author. So Stanislaw Lem is a great example of somebody who can do both of them. And he actually, he talks about this in interviews and in the Summa Technologia. He's got hard science fiction stuff that he writes where he's trying to remain true to the science that we know of the time. And then he's got other stuff where you could have an assemblage of races in space and, all sorts of things that Lem doesn't think are actually possible for the science that he knows. And he's a great writer with either of them. I suppose I'm probably more, the authors that I read are probably more soft science fiction than hard. Like, where would you put Philip K. Dick? I think he's probably soft science fiction more than hard science fiction. And I certainly like him quite a lot, Let's see here. And Olivia, do you have any thoughts on DC Schindler's work? Haven't read him for 20 years, so no. Proof Rocks, books for young folks who are lost in life and treading near misanthropy. One good one would be Plato's Phaedo, where he actually discusses how people become misanthropes and why, to some degree, it's their own fault for being uncritical about who they take in and trust, right? But I think that reading fiction where it's not namby-pamby, ooh, everything's great, we're all wonderful kind of stuff. It's like, realistic in the sense of like treating human motives and actions in a realistic way, but with some sort of level of, I don't know, maybe transcendence. So it could be fantasy or sci-fi or horror, other genre stuff. And has compelling characters and depth to it. Could be good. Like, reading Ursula K. Le Guin, right? Her characters, many of them have shitty lives and figure out how to either deal with it or not deal with it. They talk with each other. I'm this coming week, my students are starting a Wizard of Earthsea, and Ursula K. Le Guin's books are books of loneliness very often, especially like The Beginning Place. Holy crap, is that a tough book, right? But there's something that shines through that you see, which can sustain you. I'll say this: reading Ursula K. Le Guin's books for me as a kid who was living in some very dark times with, my dad dying, us going from being sort of solidly middle class, even striving to get into the upper middle class, back down into the working class, dealing with all sorts of other issues going on, an alcoholic grandfather who lived with us, who sometimes we'd have to take care of, all the usual stuff with cliques and bullying. Boy, her works helped to sustain me in a way that other authors who I really like Roger Zelazny and Philip Jose Farmer, maybe didn't. So finding authors like that might be helpful for you. Brandon, are there grounds for another criminal indictment of Donald Trump because of the whole Arlington fiasco? I mean, if we were a proper country, yeah. But if we were a proper country, he would have never gotten in office in the first place. The fact that we can have, like 40% of the people in this nation thinking that, a just complete scumbag like him deserves to be in office because it furthers some sort of agenda that they have. It's a sign of just how far we've degenerated, and we probably won't get it back, Vegan Sports Bar, in Book 1 of the Metaphysics, Aristotle claims that an artist's wisdom is perceived as superior to a man of experience because the former knows the cause of wisdom and the latter does not. Is this a critique of Plato's Ion? So I don't know what translation you're using, but artist is the wrong term. It would be somebody who knows something, right? Somebody who actually, like a doctor, for example, a doctor, because Aristotle uses medical examples a lot. Now, sometimes it's the case that the person who actually has the knowledge or skill base, whatever we want to call it, is better situated to figure things out than the person who just has experience, right? So Aristotle, eating this particular meat is healthy. Eating this is not for this person. Somebody who's got experience might figure that out. The doctor actually knows why that's the case, even if they don't necessarily get everything right. Now, Plato's Ion. So Plato's kind of unfair to poets, rhapsodes, other people who work with stuff. And you notice he's like attacking Homer, for example. And he says, does Homer actually know anything about the things that he tells us about, like chariot racing or running a government or stuff like that? No, he just knows how to talk well about that and, sound convincing, but he doesn't actually understand these topics. So, yeah, that's could it be a critique of that? What the critique would have to be would be that you could. So here's where you could criticize it. Plato treats knowledge kind of as like you either have it or you don't have it. If you have it, you like have it completely. And it's difficult to explain cases where we kind of know stuff, but we kind of don't, and we're developing. I think Aristotle is much more realistic about that than Plato is in some of those dialogues. And in the Ion, it's the same thing with a lot of Platonic dialogues. When you're reading it, you're like, oh man, he should have said this or should have said that, But I don't know that it's like an overt critique. I think usually when Aristotle wants to criticize somebody on something, he'll mention, I'm criticizing Plato here. I think that, he's got this wrong. Sam says, are you a nominalist? If so, why? If not, why? I'm not much of an ist of any sort of things. I don't tend to do my philosophy, but like picking big categories and saying, let's have everything flow from those. I tend to do things more, piecemeal, I would say, than that. So, yeah. But that said, if I had to pick, like, where do I fit in? Am I a nominalist? Do I believe that all we really have are names, that we don't really have, full concepts that connect with things in the outside world, but only like sort of composite images of them? I don't really buy into that sort of thing. I'm not like a Platonist either, in most respects. I mean, kind of with mathematics, I think. But yeah, I don't really think of myself in terms of nominalism versus realism very much. Where are we? Let's see. We just skipped a little bit. Ty says, in philosophy, there's a great deal of writing about being virtuous or doing the right thing, often from the point of view of a normal moral agent, but I'm curious about the point of view of agents who are bad persons or persons who have committed some significant wrong. Obviously, they should stop committing wrongs or attempt to deal with their vices, but I wonder if there's anything deeper about how they ought to perceive themselves and move forward. I mean, there's plenty of stuff about that. When you read around in classic literature, I don't know that there's that much in contemporary literature, but certainly, think about the Stoics, right? Does Seneca just say, well, here's how to be virtuous? No, he says, hey, and you're screwed up and I'm screwed up, and here's what we need to stop doing so that we can be less screwed up, and here's the steps to take and all that. We see that with Plutarch. We see that with certain Aristotelians. It's kind of a common thing in ancient and medieval philosophy, and even in modern philosophy. If we don't just stick with like the typical canon works and we read around quite a bit more, there's plenty of that being discussed as resources for us. I think there's a lot of abstraction in contemporary moral philosophy, but that doesn't always have to be the case. And there's also lots of other good stuff available for us out there in contemporary philosophy. We gotta look for it. We have to do the work of digging around and finding it, right? So, yeah. SV says, any nihilism related book suggestions? I mean, my favorite Dostoevsky novel is The Possessed, or The Demons. And there's a nihilist cell in that, and there are nihilist characters. So that might be something cool to check out. There's also, one of the earlier uses of nihilism is in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. That's a fun book just for its own sake. But there's a character, Bazarov, who claims to be a nihilist. You might check that out. Obviously, Nietzsche is somebody who engages with it quite a bit. It's in a lot of different works of his. Maybe Beyond Good and Evil would be a good place to go, or Genealogy of Morality. Nietzsche actually thought that nihilism was going to be the problem of the 20th century. And I'm sure there's some books out there that just explicitly thematize it. There's probably books titled Nihilism, but I haven't read them. So, all right. Bellal says, do you think there's certain bands that have great lyrics that you may consider philosophical? Can you name the top 3 or 5? Yeah, it depends on what you call philosophical. I mean, there are bands that raise interesting issues about freedom and determinism. Think about Rush's Free Will, right? There's a very clear meditation on the nature of free will that's rather existentialist. There's a lot of stuff about sort of like ethics and our priorities and how we live our life, contrasting different ways of life. I would say that there can be like interesting exhortations about how even though your life might suck, it's not that bad. One of the lines from Megadeth that I often bring up, which is kind of a good encompassment of my political commitments overall, goes, if there's a new way, I'll be the first in line, but it better work this time. You know, I'm perfectly happy to change things to make them better, but it better actually make them better. It must not just be for public consumption or clout or stuff like that. That's a philosophical stance, isn't it? And you know, I think we could find all sorts of other points of view within musical lyrics. I mean, not a lot off that comes to mind for me, but maybe other people have some ideas about that. Idlesome, how exactly do Aristotelian virtue ethics and Stoicism differ? On a whole bunch of different ways. The very conception of what virtue is virtue primarily a habit or a hexis, or is it a knowledge, an episteme? That's a big one right there. Although there's some overlap with both of them. The nature of how proairesis figures into it. Proairesis is only an important term for one Stoic, and that's Epictetus, and he doesn't mean exactly the same thing by it as Aristotle does. It's massively important for Aristotle. How do we organize the virtues? The Stoics have 4 cardinal virtues that have subordinate virtues. Aristotle has just a listing of different virtues. So take magnanimity, which we talked about just a little bit earlier in this session. That for Aristotle is its own separate virtue that has to do with honor and whether we seek it, deserve it, that sort of thing. For the Stoics, it actually figures under the virtue of courage. So, you know, those are 2 important differences there. And we could go on and on. There's quite a few other differences. You know, what virtues do we recognize? How do we define the virtues? So those are some important things. The other thing I would say that's very different between official Stoic and Aristotelian, and the Aristotelians are kind of like everybody else, and the Stoics are the outliers with this, although they're not unique. There are a few others, the Cynics, some unorthodox Stoics like Aristotle. The Stoics think that virtue is both necessary and sufficient for happiness. The Aristotelians say virtue is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need some wealth, you need some relationships. So that's an important difference as well between those 2. So, autistic predator, do you lift? Yeah, although I haven't done it for a while. I've been, since I had my gallbladder out, I haven't been back to the gym. I just do some other exercise instead. But once we do our move, I'll probably start again later on this fall. I started lifting when I was 13, before I went to high school, and then, did it through there, did it through the Army, did it through college, kind of got sick of it, like about 3/4 of the way through grad school, started up again, and, occasionally in my 30s and 40s, and, was going pretty regularly here in Milwaukee to the Wisconsin Athletic Club. where I do, the weight circuit. I don't do free weights. I enjoy doing it. It's a nice, relaxing thing for me. It's also good for my body, so I need to get back to it. Brandon says, as a philosopher, did you benefit as a kid from reading Calvin and Hobbes? Well, I wasn't a philosopher as a kid. I didn't really get into philosophy in any serious way until college. I did enjoy Calvin and Hobbes, but I wouldn't say that Calvin and Hobbes is particularly philosophical. It's fun and funny, but sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I would say Doonesbury is just as philosophical as Calvin and Hobbes, or what were other comics that I like to read? Before he came out with The Simpsons, Matt Groening's Life and Hell, pretty philosophical, right? But I wasn't thinking about it in terms of philosophy, I was just thinking it more about, these are funny and I enjoy the wittiness and, the points that they make. I wasn't taking it as something to provide life guidance for me, or, a picture of the universe or anything like that. David Smith, would you be interested in doing a video on the invention of Morel? I'm assuming that's morals or morality. I already have. I've done like a whole series on Nietzsche's genealogy of morality, and I've done other videos on other thinkers who have discussions about the origins of ethics or morality or moral viewpoints. So I don't see any reason for me to reinvent a wheel that doesn't seem to need it, Richard Kreese, who do you think you might vote for in the upcoming presidential election and why? That's pretty simple for me. I'm a registered independent who probably for my lifetime will be voting straight Democrat in election after election, in part because the Republican Party has degenerated so far from what I knew it as a kid, a teenager, a 20-something. It's now turned into the crazy MAGA cult, and there's no room for actual conservatives within the Republican Party. It's essentially a fascist party at this point. And as we're finding out, all these influencers, as we know, big surprise, are getting paid by Russia as part of a undermining American democracy campaign. So there's no reason why we should work with these people. It's not that the Democrats are perfect or I'm super happy with everything, but they certainly are the lesser evil. I don't want to see another Trump administration. What I would like to see is a come to Jesus moment where the current Republicans are like, holy crap, we really went out into loony land. We got to dial this crap back and eliminate some of the bad actors in our party and get rid of all this taking money from the Russians for stuff. And if they do that, maybe I'll consider voting Republican again. I've voted Republican for quite a few candidates in different elections, but current one, it ain't going to happen. The MAGA thing is just too disgusting to allow back in. McKenya Daima, we recently lost a great philosopher, Professor Michael Sugray. Did you know him? What can you say about him? I never met the guy. I don't really, I don't know much about him. I've seen his videos. He's okay. I never found him like super impressive. I guess a lot of people really, really like him. And I guess it was good that he had other people to film his stuff and put his things on YouTube. But he's not somebody that I've really thought much about, frankly. So yeah. San, can you talk a bit about your personal approach to anger? Do you see it as sometimes justified as a sign of self-respect and boundary setting? Yeah, so I don't go full Stoic. The Stoics quite famously thought that anger was never good. Aristotle thinks that sometimes it's needed, and you could call it boundary setting or protecting those who need protecting values who need it. you got to be super, super, super careful to not bullshit yourself into thinking that I'm just setting healthy boundaries when you're actually acting like a rageaholic jerk. That's one of the most seductive aspects about anger, that it makes us think that we're actually doing the right thing when we're not doing the right thing. So we got to be super, super careful. I think that there could be instances where a person is justified in feeling anger. Does that mean that they should act on it or express it? That's a whole other question. Often people don't make that distinction. They think, oh, if I'm justified in feeling it, then I can do whatever the hell I want to. And that's just not the case. I mean, Aristotle will tell you that, this is actually a quote that makes its way into the very first line of Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. It's easy to get angry, but to get angry with the right people at the right time for the right reason, for the right amount of time in the right way, well, that's very difficult, and not everybody is capable of that. So we strive for, if we're going to have anger, we really want to make sure it's over the right stuff. It's being directed at the right people. We're not overreacting. We're not holding on to anger for a very long time where it becomes kind of a poisonous grudge that gets held. So, yeah. All right. Skull Knight. Is it a good idea to start learning philosophy by exploring a certain question from ancient to contemporary views? Like, what does it mean for an act to be morally right or wrong, or what is being? Sure. There's a lot of different ways to begin learning philosophy. That's one of them. You could begin with a certain topic that you're really interested in. Pick something you're really interested in, because if you're going to do like this, survey of all these people, if you're not interested in it, you're going to find it pretty boring pretty quick. But yeah, that's a way to do it. It could be about, what is right and wrong. It could be, do we have freedom? It could be, how should we organize society? It could even be aesthetic things like what is beautiful and what's not, and what is our basis for saying these sorts of things, right? Now, figuring out who you should read, that might take a bit more doing. But fortunately, we live in a time where there's lots of information available on the web about that. And you can't possibly study everybody and everything, so you'll have to be a little bit selective about who it is that you're going into. But yeah, that's a good way to do things. My intro to philosophy classes, they're kind of organized in a way around that. We explore freedom and determinism. We explore ethics. We explore character and how it's formed, and power relations within society, and some epistemological themes. We also explore metaphysics in terms of like the causes and appearance and reality. And I have them read some Plato, some Aristotle, some Cicero, some Seneca, some Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Rene Descartes, David Hume, and Mary Wollstonecraft, and we finish up with some Sartre and de Beauvoir. So obviously not a comprehensive survey of these questions, right? But it's a good way to do things, I think. Shamrock has a question that's kind of similar to the question about imposter syndrome at the start of the AMA. I'm about to submit my PhD dissertation soon, so good job. Congratulations on that. But for the past 4 years, I've been battling a feeling of not being good and successful enough in comparison to others. Have you ever experienced that? Yeah. And I still continue to experience that every once in a while. I see a colleague who has a new book out, and I'm reminded of the fact that I've had the intention of writing a book on this or on that, and I just haven't made it happen. It doesn't go away completely, but when those thoughts come up, you don't have to accept those thoughts. You can actually question them and say, imagine you're having a dialogue, and your thoughts are like, oh, everybody else is doing so much better than you. What's wrong with you, you loser, right? And you can be like, well, who the hell are you to make these judgments? How do you know that they're actually doing better? And, did they have any like help along the way? I mean, when I think about my colleagues who are able to publish things, I'm like, well, they're only teaching 2 classes a semester and they got a secure academic position, and they get money for buying books and going to conferences and things, and you don't actually get that. So you want to compare things on a level field, which includes like the support that people are getting too as well. So I don't know, that might be helpful. If you've brought a dissertation to its final end, that's a lot of work. So that is certainly something to celebrate, even if it's not like the absolute best. It could be improved. Well, guess what? Everybody's dissertation could be improved. You're not supposed to write your master work. I know your professors sometimes are like, you must be making a solid contribution to the field. And that's stupid, because most of the time we're not. Very few dissertations actually make massive new contributions to the field. And if they do, it's usually after they get revised into something else, after the person has, finished defending it, they edit it and turn it into something. All right, David says, some exploration of Ted Chiang's work would be awesome too. Yeah, it'd be nice if I could get to that. I got so many different people to read. He's definitely somebody on my radar, but not for this year. Maybe for next year's Worlds of Speculative Fiction. We always do a kind of poll. We do first suggestions, then I take the top 6 suggestions and have people vote on them. And so, he sometimes gets in there. I just haven't done him yet. Mage of War. There's a recent movement to include dialectical thinking in psychology. From your knowledge of dialectical thought, Plato, Hegel, Marx, the Frankfurt School, what is your evaluation? Dialectic is a thing that means different things in different people's work. So what Hegel's doing in dialectic has nothing to do with, or what Plato's doing with dialectic has nothing to do with what Hegel's doing with dialectic, which actually doesn't have much to do with what Marx is doing with dialectic. He's got a whole different model. Frankfurt School is a bunch of weirdos who they're not all on the same page with each other. So you got to specify whose dialectic you mean. And there's a lot of different dialectics out there. It's not just Plato, Hegel, Marx, Frankfurt School. Aristotle has a whole book devoted to dialectic called The Topics. There's a lot of different things out there. And it's not a recent movement to include dialectical thought in psychology. That's been going on for, close to a century. Maybe in certain schools of philosophy, they've recently rediscovered dialectic, but even dialectical behavior therapy has been around for a while. So, I don't know that we can say all that much about it, other than if you've got a good dialectic, it might actually be helpful, right? All right. Oh, I just skipped a little bit here. Brandon says, so you're saying it's simply that authorities are cowed from really dealing with Trump fairly because of the potential blowback from his fanatical followers. So I'm going to stop you right there on simply. Nothing in politics is simply. There's always complex causality at work. I'm not making a claim like that. I said what I said, if I wanted to say what you're saying, I would have said that. So I'm sure there's some of that, but there's also some of like, well, we still got to play by the rules, even though these people aren't playing by the rules. There's all sorts of reasons why Trump isn't getting the justice that he deserves. So Eli says, how would you reply to somebody who says that ethics, moral judgments are totally subjective, partly because the world is changing constantly, therefore those judgments can't remain the same? I would say, where the hell did you get any of that from? And what's your basis for saying that? You just got that on vibes and feels? Because you sure as hell don't know anything about the entire world. When did you ever observe the entire universe? And you can say that everything is changing. I mean, these are the sort of things where when somebody says that sort of stuff, I mean, one alternative is just to say, cool, see you later, because you're not going to get any good conversation out of that sort of person if they believe that dogmatically. But you could also say, well, that's a very curious idea. What's your actual basis for that? And it usually winds up, well, I read it in a website somewhere, or I read it in a book, or I just feel that way. That's not a basis for saying anything now, is it? So that would be how you could respond. I mean, if you want to be facetious, you could say, okay, cool. And then like push them down and be like, morality just changed. It's cool to like beat you up. And then suddenly they're no longer a relativist, right? Socrates' great grandson, how would a virtue ethicist respond to the trolley problem? Depends on the virtue ethicist, depends on the conditions, right? There isn't a simple answer to that. Big T, how do you deal with annoying undergrads that think they know it all already? Usually I tell them that usually what they're bringing up, I'll be like, well, you're actually wrong about that. And early on in the class, we like an intro to philosophy class, we do the Meno, right? And we talk about how if you think that you know stuff already, then you can't actually learn anything. And what's the point of being in this class if you're not here to learn, right? I actually have a student right now in one of my classes who wants to be a philosophy major, has read a good bit of Christian apologetics, wants to bring Christianity into class, and I'll be like, we're doing Plato, that's not relevant. So I just close them down and go back to what we're talking about. Sometimes if somebody wants to monopolize class time, you can say, listen, buddy, you're one student. We got 26 other people here in the class. They're here to learn. Are they here to learn from you? Or are we going to like study some Plato together? So I think that can work. Mohammed, what GPA do Ivy League or prestigious schools typically expect for in a master's or PhD program? Nobody knows. The only way you could find that out would be to survey all the schools and not have them lie to you about what they're looking for. Nobody knows, so, and it's not just GPA, it's also your GREs and your writing sample and, whose ass you've kissed to get a letter of recommendation and who and all these other factors that figure in. GPA is probably the least important thing that you're going to bring up because GPA doesn't mean anything. All it means is in the particular place that you went to, you managed to earn a certain score. It's not comparable to scores in other places. We know that like in the Ivy League institutions, grade inflation for generations has been rampant, so the grades don't really mean much of anything. Revo says, thank you for all that you do. You're very welcome. Orville, with the rising political polarization, is there a philosopher you feel is more culturally relevant than the others right now? Not really. I mean, I guess Aristotle, if you think about Politics, Book 5, the discussion of social breakdown, which we call stasis, often translated as revolution. He's got some remarks that if you read through them, you'd be kind of pessimistic about American society. I don't know that it has much to say about the polarization in other countries, though, right? Because polarization doesn't just happen here. It happens in Brazil, between the two big presidential candidates and their parties. It happens in Britain. It happens in France. It happens in Germany. And we could go on and on and on, right? But Aristotle might be a good place to look. Yeah. Vegan Sports Bar. I'm reading the complete works of Aristotle, the revised Oxford translation. Do you have any suggestions for a good English translation? I never have good suggestions for translations because I'm handicapped in the fact that if I want to, I can go to the Greek and read that and see what the original says. So that makes me, in some respects, less effective because I can take a crappy translation, and as soon as it gets a little wonky, I just go to the Greek. So I don't do a lot of compare translations with each other. JD Sword, good to see you here. What can one do to stay optimistic and engaged when the world seems so bleak and run by either madmen or plutocrats? I don't know that you have to stay optimistic. I think you just have to be realistic and able to get by. It depends on what you mean by optimism, right? We don't have to be positive all the time. We can sometimes say that things really suck, and it's unfortunate that we're stuck where we are, but we can still live and manage and get by. And the fact that, like, for example, here in the United States, our political system is like all sorts of levels of screwed up, right? We let all these lobbyists essentially buy Congress people and senators and presidential candidates, and our federal bureaucracy doesn't work all that well. And we have all sorts of people in law enforcement who are secret MAGA types. There's a lot of inequity in how taxes work. And every time we try to straighten it out, the rich people try to throw a monkey wrench into it. All that can be true. And I can still go and have a good walk in the park with my kid here in Milwaukee and have a great conversation and share a good meal afterwards. And all of that positive value doesn't go away just because this other stuff sucks. I can recognize the fact that the way jobs work in academia is not a meritocracy, but rather, very inequitable and unfair. And a lot of us don't even know it until we get, years into it, and still say, well, I'm going to teach intro to philosophy to these kids and I'm going to do a good job at it. It doesn't have to, things can be bad, but we don't have to be Pollyannish about it. We don't have to be optimists. We can say, can I still function? Can I still live a good life? And most of the time the answer is yes. Now, I'm not a stoic in the sense of thinking that like indifference do not matter at all. I can be happy on the rack. I can't. Actually, Seneca said he couldn't either. But we can be relatively happy and cultivate good relationships and behave in ways that we have good reason to think are right, even if things are pretty crappy. Brandon says Ignatius from Confederacy of Dunces is kind of a nihilist. I don't know. I mean, the last time I read Confederacy of Dunces was in college. So we're talking about at least 30 years ago. So I don't remember enough about it to say. EST. What do you think is the best part of Hegel's philosophy? That's a tough one. I like Hegel's dialectical approach when he's just like doing it and not talking about it so much. Like, for example, everybody in the phenomenology always wants to talk about the master-slave dialectic, and that's sexy and cool and all that. But what comes after it, his analyses of Stoicism and skepticism and the unhappy consciousness, more important, more interesting. He gets Stoicism wrong. I think his analysis of skepticism is kind of interesting, though. And and we're only talking about the phenomenology at this point, but I really like the morality section and the careful, in-depth analysis about like how each time that we think we've finally figured ethics out, there's like a new wrinkle that comes in and we got to figure out how to bring that in. I like that. Now, I'm probably an outlier when it comes to appreciating that aspect of Hegel's work. So yeah, that's probably enough about that. Mindoc, do you have a favorite decade for science fiction literature? I've never thought about it that way. Like, is there a best decade for me? I can't think of one, because you almost always find some good stuff that's worth reading in. I mean, not every decade, obviously, right? I don't know that there was a ton of science fiction to read in, say, the 1880s, by comparison to once pulps came out. But there's great stuff throughout, all the time, and we can say the same thing for fantasy or horror as well, right? So, Orville says, "What are you drinking?" Non-alcoholic Guinness. We get these whenever they go on sale. So having a pint, and it's really cool because these non-alcoholic beers have gotten so good. Like, there's no way you would tell this apart from a Guinness that's actually alcoholic and poured for you. So I enjoy these. Heineken's got a great NA beer as well, and then there's all these others that are really quite good too. Das Right, are you aware of Bernardo Kastrup's metaphysical idealism? I'm not even aware of Bernardo Kastrup. I have no idea who that is, which doesn't mean anything about Bernardo Kastrup. There's like tens of thousands of people writing at any given time, and we can't read all of them. So, Black Prairie, what's the best place to start with Ortega y Gasset and Gabriel Marcel? Ortega y Gasset, I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time reading him. It's been a while since I have spent time on him. Gabriel Marcel, okay, where I start students is with the ontological mystery essay, because I think that's a good one for introducing quite a few of his key ideas. That he's got like the distinction between mystery and problem. He discusses a couple of different mysteries. He always has some good examples. I mean, if you had to pick like one Gabriel Marcel book, because he often goes over some of the same themes from book to book, his Gifford lectures are pretty good. That's like a 2-volume set. The Mystery of Being. Those are pretty good, I would say. Arca Pravo says, which author comes the closest to Gene Wolfe? Well, I don't know. Gene Wolfe's stuff is very lush and complicated and imaginative. I don't know. I mean, there's people whose works we could use those terms to qualify them, but they're not writing like the same stuff as Gene Wolfe. And it's not as Wolfe is kind of an ornate Baroque kind of writer. But there's people who have similar scope, you could say, of thought. Maybe, R. Scott Bakker, probably darker than Wolfe. I'm blanking on his name, the Malazan author, Stephen. I'm coming up with the guy who he writes with. Anyway, him, or there's others as well. But I don't know. Wolfe is kind of his own thing, right? So, Leonidas says, what do you think about Meditations on Love by Ortega y Gasset? Never read it, so I can't think anything of it. Blank name, can you recommend philosophers who talk about unrequited love? My guess is Rilke talks about it in Kierkegaard. Well, the first friend zoning that we get in philosophy is in Plato's Symposium, isn't it? Alcibiades is in love with Socrates and can't get Socrates to screw him. the way that he wants to. Even, and Socrates is an ugly guy, and Alcibiades is really, really good looking. And he even gets Socrates to lay down naked with him, and Socrates doesn't do anything and gets up the next day and he's like, oh, see you later. And he's like, what's wrong with me? So he's pining away. That would be one example of that. I don't know. It's not a topic, unrequited love, that I've thought an awful lot about in terms of philosophy. But yeah, Kierkegaard and Rilke would definitely be people. I mean, Dostoevsky has some characters who love each other and don't get where they want to go. Nietzsche, quite famously, was, really into Lou Salome, who, by the way, did later on hook up with Rilke, but he didn't make any headway with her. I wonder, Lou Salome actually has a book called The Erotic. That might be worth checking out. And I think, is it Stendhal who has like a whole book on love? I checked it out once, but never got around to actually reading more than like the introduction. Lots of 18th century writers who talk about love and desire and, men and women and stuff like that, including Mary Wollstonecraft. They might be worth checking out, but I don't know that she talks that much about unrequited love, so yeah. On to Livia, I'm fascinated by Charles Taylor's discussion of the porous self in his Secular Age, or the dialogical self in Taylor's early work. Are there any other works exploring these ideas that you recommend? It's been a long time since I've read Taylor. I never really enjoyed reading Taylor. I understand that he's viewed as important, but I never really got into him, and I kind of figured the stuff that I would get from him, I could get from McIntyre or from other authors anyway. So I'm not a good person to talk about that. David Marazzo, I really enjoy the history of metal discussions you and Scott have. Yeah, we're going to be doing some more of those coming up. By the way, we got a big thing happening this month. It's scheduled for Saturday the 21st. So if you like Blue Oyster Cult, we are going to have Buck Dharma, who is a friend of Scott's, come on, and we're going to do an interview with him. So that should be a lot of fun. But we do have some plans for some more history of heavy metal stuff. I want to do something on the rise of the thrash scene in the U.S. and in Europe. I want to do something specifically on the development of metal in the Nordic countries, because by the 80s, we already had some pretty important bands. Oz in Finland, Torch in Sweden, Merciful Fate. We can think of others as well. So, yeah, a lot of cool stuff coming up with that. Charlie says, do you have any thoughts on Henri Lefebvre, in particular his idea of rhythm analysis in the production of the city? Haven't read him since grad school either, so I don't have any thoughts on Lefebvre. So David Smith, The Invention of Morel, is an incredible novel by Adolfo Bioy Casares, a good friend of Borges. He would love it. Well, okay, I'll take your word for it. I got so much to read right now, I probably won't. I could promise to get to it, and I probably wouldn't do it. Lapse 9 Continuum. I recently stumbled across a video of Dennis Noble criticizing what he calls the neo-Darwinian paradigm. Do you think modern evolutionary biology might be overly averse to teleological explanation? It's overly averse to good teleological explanation. Evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology love crappy teleological explanation. Like, hey, everything is about passing on your genes. Well, where did you ever get that from? That's a huge assumption, right? But that's a teleological explanation for stuff. A lot of the stuff that they put out there as science is pretty pseudoscientific. So, I'm pretty leery of a lot of that. John Marco, I've known you after watching your lectures on Nicomachean ethics. Is this a good path to follow if I'm interested in improving my career? I'm not sure what the it is. Watching videos, reading the Nicomachean ethics. I'm not sure what you're asking about, so I don't know that I can actually give an answer to that. Ethan says, do you think Marcus Aurelius is a good philosopher? Personally, I really like his works, but I noticed others saying he's lacking as a philosopher when compared to the other greats. Yeah, I mean, he's an okay philosopher. He didn't intend to be a philosopher, so the bar is kind of low. Certainly among the Stoics who we have, he's not the most important. I know a lot of people like to use him as an entry point, but sooner or later, the two big heavy hitters whose works we have are Epictetus and Seneca. And Marcus isn't as good as either of them, but he didn't intend to be, right? He just intended to write this stuff to himself. So it'd be kind of unfair to hold him to a standard that he wasn't holding himself. DPP, are you planning to make self-directed study videos on more philosophers? Yeah, it's just a matter of finding the time. We're in the process of moving this month, and I'm teaching 4 academic classes and 1 class in my Study with Sadler Academy, and I've got a full slate of tutorial students, philosophical counseling clients, and stuff like that. And we're organizing Stoicon, so that pretty busy time. It'll probably have to wait until November or December for me to get to that. Revo, how much do you read each week? It depends. There's no number. And reading is different, reading fiction compared to philosophy. Reading philosophy takes you longer typically. If it doesn't, then you're probably not reading it right? Ileana, enjoyed listening to you on Acid Horizon from a while back. Curious if you got anything of reading Nick Land. Not much. A few of his essays are interesting. He certainly is somebody who's way overrated. I mean, when I read Fang Noumena, and I read all the essays in Fang Noumena, I was like, this is just the kind of shit that we were doing in the 90s. I mean, all of us were doing that kind of stuff. Here's a little Heidegger. Here's an idea. Here's something else. Oh, I'm going to tie it in with this thing over here. And I was like, why do people think this is so profound? Because, he doesn't provide much explanation, let alone argument for the positions he holds. He's just kind of throwing stuff in there the way that people used to back in continental philosophy in the 90s. At sort of like the secondary level, not really good stuff. So I don't know. I think he was really good at hype, and people bought into it. And and then he went to China and got into the Dark Enlightenment stuff, and now he's just kind of a kook. David Scaraphone, how do we generate a basis? I don't know. It depends on what your basis is. I'm not sure what that is. Andy's here. Good. See, how's the move going? I hope it's not too stressful. I imagine moving those books is a pain. Well, the good news is the majority of the books have been moved into the storage locker. So that part of the move is finished. And I moved a lot of other stuff as well. I still have 2 big Billy bookshelves filled with books that have to go, but I'm using those as backdrops for shooting videos, so I won't be boxing those up for a while. And yeah, moving is a pain. I mean, I'm not going to be moving all the stuff. We're going to get some young, big, strong guys to move the bed, move the bookshelves, so I don't hurt my back and all, the sort of things that I'm liable to. I will tell you this, it's interesting. I observed this yesterday. I was talking with a friend of mine who is a former NFL player. So, athlete at a very high level. And he's in his late 30s, I want to say. And I'm in my mid 50s, and I was telling him about the moving stuff. And I was like, yeah, man, I just don't have the energy that I used to. And I say, okay, I'm going to do this amount. And then I do that and I get back and I'm all sweaty and take a shower and I'm ready to go to sleep, because I've worn my body out. And he was like, yeah, that's the way it's getting to be, so that's how it goes. Sunyata, do you think there's a meaning crisis? I certainly don't think it in the sense that the people who blather about a meaning crisis and try to sell you books about it do. We've been talking about whatever you want to call it, the problem of nihilism, meaning crisis, all these sorts of things since the 19th century. So there's no new meaning crisis. It's not radically, distinct from previous meaning crises that have been going on. And if you've read much 19th and 20th century literature and philosophy, you know that these ideas have been around for a long time. So how much of a crisis could it possibly be? Crisis kind of implies, oh, it's really bad right now. It's been bad for a long time, So I kind of don't think there's a meaning crisis because of that. DPP, how can someone manage his finances if he wishes to devote a lot of time to philosophy? Isn't it difficult for the person to deal with the world once he transcends everyday trivialities? Well, maybe not all philosophy is about transcending everyday trivialities. And actually, if you're doing philosophy well, I would imagine you should get better at everyday trivialities because you find ways to apply it to that. But, if you're doing something that's like totally abstract, well, that might be a problem for you. It's not the way I do philosophy. So, I don't have anything to say about that. Abraham says, what are your views on the philosophy of Alan Watts? Another person I think is very overrated. I read him a good bit when I was in high school and college because I was interested in comparative religions and found him sometimes interesting, sometimes rather superficial, I don't find him to be a great guide on a lot of stuff. I think he's sort of a creature of his time, creature of the hippie age, let's say. So I don't hold him in high esteem. Mohiz says, are you a fan of Derek Parfit? Any thoughts on his triple theory? What do you think about his On What Matters? I haven't read Parfit in years, only read him because we were supposed to, and I didn't find him particularly interesting. So I don't have any thoughts about him. Johan says, just wanted to say thank you very much for your half-hour Hegel series. They've been helpful for me without a formal education in philosophy. That's good to hear. Yeah. It took me 9 years to do because I didn't make my quotas a lot of the time. And it was a bigger project than I thought it was going to be. I don't know what I was thinking originally. But yeah, it's paid off pretty well. I'm glad that it's helpful for people. I get some nice comments every once in a while on the videos. All right, so let's take some questions from people I haven't addressed before. Isaac Romero, do you have a favorite work from Graham Greene? If so, what is it? That's a tough one. I am a big fan of Greene, and I'm rereading one that would certainly be up there, The Ministry of Fear, which is a good one. Brighton Rock is pretty heart-wrenching as well. But I've sometimes said, because people will be like, the greatest Catholic novel of the 20th century is Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. And I'll be like, yeah, it's a pretty good book. But I think the best is actually Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, about a whiskey priest caught behind the lines in Mexico where performing the sacraments could get that guy killed. And he knows he's not up to the task, but he he's going to try until they find him and kill him, JK says, what got you into analyzing Borges? Side note, that series is what brought me back to your channel. I've been interested in Borges since I encountered him as an undergraduate in a world literature class. And I actually tried to write a book when I had finished college. I was just working. That would be like studies of Borges stories. So it's something I've wanted to do for a very, very long time. And I had a great conversation with Virgil that you can see in one of my Ideas That Matter videos about Borges. And that got me thinking, yeah, I should get around to actually like doing analyses of these. And I might still write a book about Borges stories. Might collaborate with Virgil on that. So, Russell says, do you agree with any of Philip K. Dick's metaphysical views on Christianity and Gnosticism? I mean, I don't like embrace Gnosticism of a sort the way that he did, but I do think that, oftentimes, so he's writing in a time when they're like finding these Gnostic texts and thinking about it. They've been around for a very long time now for those of us who are, say, my age. And I think that, the stories that we tell ourselves about the church and what Christianity is really about, it's not as if the Gnostics, who are like a whole bag of different groups that didn't like each other, are always right, but the Orthodox shtick isn't always right either. And so, sometimes it's a matter of emphasis. And I like the fact that Dick is incorporating this stuff into his works. Mindoc says, what are your favorite works by Philip Jose Farmer? Probably the River World series, I would say. I mean, World of Tears is pretty good, and he's got other stuff. I've been meaning to get back to his Doc Savage stuff, which I read when I was in high school and haven't read since. That could be kind of fun. Let's see. Scott says, love your work. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with the world. My question is, what do you think is the most interesting philosophical debate that's still being debated today? I don't know, because I don't really think in terms of debates. There's certainly topics that where do we actually have some freedom and responsibility? If you want to call that a debate, that's probably of great interest to me. I don't usually talk about it in terms of free will, because that could mean a million different things. But it's an interesting topic that I explore quite a bit. All right, we're kind of running out of time, so let me grab a few things that I could easily address. Let's see here. Hong says, what are your thoughts about Spinoza's philosophy? I'm not a big fan of Spinoza. A lot of people get into him, but I think a lot of people don't really understand what he's saying, and it's more about feels and things like that than like actually engaging with his ideas. I just don't find most of his ideas very plausible. Let's see, who else do we have? Taylor LePere says, who is your favorite of the church fathers? So there's a lot of people in there. I like Augustine quite a bit. I like Lactantius. He's a fun guy to read, and he's kind of an outlier on a lot of stuff. But he's somebody who like knows his ancient philosophy really well. Clement of Alexandria, I'm kind of a big fan of him as well. John Cassian, those are probably the ones I go to the most. Let's see here. Oh, Ileana says your videos on Lovecraft are the best I found on him on YouTube. That's very nice. I will be doing more on other stories, but probably not until next year. Fingon, how to escape from the state of acedia or sloth, which is the capital vice that encompass that, and sadness. Doing nothing substantial all day, believing everything you start is bound to fail, that you don't have enough intellectual capacity for anything. Well, I would say on that, I just mentioned John Cassian, and you could also look at Evagrius Ponticus. They both have recommendations about those matters. So I would read the part of Cassian's institutes and his conferences, and then Evagrius Ponticus has a lot of different things about the 8. He doesn't call them capital vices; he calls them the bad thoughts. But that could be quite helpful for you. So, all right. Well, so we're getting close to the end. Lapse 9 Continuum. Ever listen to Typo Negative? If I have, I don't remember it. Maybe I heard him on the radio at some point. I don't know. Who else do we have? Oh, here we go. Here's a good one to go out on. Ucklis says, can philosophy and mathematics work together like natural language processing? Philosophical ideas could be embodied as matrices. Well, that's not going to work. If it's a genuine philosophical idea, you're not going to reduce it to some sort of matrix that then you can process with, linear algebra. And then, by the way, LLMs, they don't understand anything, right? They're just predictive devices, essentially a souped up version of what in the late 80s, early 90s in programming we called nonsense generators, and we played around with before. But yeah, philosophy and mathematics. I was a philosophy and mathematics major. And so I did a lot of stuff on foundations of mathematics, the nature of logic, some stuff with, what could be computed, what couldn't be computed. We actually did a whole seminar on Gödel, Escher, Bach, like a whole semester on that work. And a lot of those things combining there, as well as music theory and some other things too. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting interconnections between the two fields. And they can work together. As I mentioned, my senior thesis as an undergraduate was on truth self-referential statement groups, and I was bringing together philosophy and mathematics to do that. So there's room for that. You end up realizing in the process that not everything can actually be brought into the scope of mathematics, but it's good to know that, right? All right. I'm going to bring it to a close. I got to get something to eat before I do my next event, my philosophy chat with Patreon supporters. So thanks for all of your questions. We got some other events coming up later this month. The interview with Buck Dharma that we'll be doing with Classic Metal class. Depending on the move schedule, I'm hoping to get to a long overdue Understanding Anger 2.0, focused on Seneca's On Anger book 2, but we'll see if we get to that. So thanks for all your questions and comments, and I will see you somewhere else down the line.